Okay, we're going into part three of the series here, and it does look like it may go on repeatedly. And so, what I am going to do is at the end of each one of these, we'll have the next two. Like this is part three. At the end of this, we'll have 4 and 5. And if there's a sixth, of course, four will have 4 and 5, and so on. If not, it'll go back to 1 and 2, and so on. So, people that are seeing this series and have missed the first parts, it would be good to look them up and go back to them. I'll try to put them down in the comments below so you can keep a congruity here on the concept that we're going through and ideas that we're running through. Now, last time we were here on the concept of Tiamat and Bahamut and the great dragons of creation that had apparently created the heavens above the earth, and that this Marduk idea where Tiamat had used her ribs to prop up the earth and so on, but conspicuously in the Jewish form of the Bible, it talks about it being a hammered out tin type of metal. So we already know that they must be using metals at the time too, that this even concept comes up. But the other forms they talk about it at the same time are of glass, like glass with bubbles in it, almost like spit in water. And like I had said before, whenever you look at like bubbles in water, and at nighttime, if you were to look at smooth water with some bubbles into it and look at the reflection and then see the reflection of the cosmos, which you could really see good if you were out away from a lot of lights, which didn't exist back then, of course, then you would see this effect that would look like bubbles in glass. You know, bad glass used to have little bubbles in it. Well, you can imagine if you made some pretty good clarity glass with a string of bubbles running through it. That's what they believe that we were in this dome that's really something like a snow globe that we apparently are supposedly live on. And we're going to go through the days of creation here and re-clarify that that's what they're talking about, and how that correlates again to Sumerian myths and Egyptians and things that are from people that are all around that area. Once you've studied the areas around there and their ancient archaic beliefs, you find that it all comes from this. Now, we talked about bara, and bara is creation, but interestingly, in the Sumerians, the Barbara people are ones who refine metals. They take rocks and are able to turn it into metals for them, and they're the people that do this type of thing. And in fact, later they hammer out tin, which is and metals, copper, bronze, which is tin and copper. So, and use these things together to help make things, which is and an unnatural thing seen at that time. You can imagine that these people didn't have anything like this, so it's very unnatural. And the fact that you could polish it and get it to where it had a shine onto it, which was very unnatural. And even stonework, whenever you would do stonework and they could get it to a fine polish. I'll talk about that here in a moment, but when you can do a stonework to get it to a fine polish, it didn't look natural at all. Granite was something they could see, that they could that had speckles into it from a distance. It looked a certain color, and things like that that they would utilize. But once you polished it down, it looked quite incredible, and for the people back then, just something simple as that or a wheel spinning was mind-blowing to most anybody that existed at that time. You have to think along their lines. So we're talking about the opening of Genesis, and it continues, and the earth was formless and void. And the phrase formless and void is a translation of the Hebrew tohu wabohu, and that's the chaos condition that starts everything. And so in the biblical idea, there is this chaos idea that comes to order, which is just like in the biblical story and in the Greek and Roman stories and in the Egyptian stories, where there was this chaos that had happened and it comes back to order. And I'm telling you that the story's not as old as the earth. It's weird, but they put it all three together at one time because people have no recollection from the time before. Once you come through the ice age and come out of that fog that's there, people knew that there's something big that happened right there. And then later stories get passed down, and then it's so long distant to them that they pretty much put it as the creation, whenever the creation of Earth is like 4.2 billion years ago, and all the dinosaurs and things that we know now. But people saw this as that form and gave it this idea, which has lasted quite incredibly, because it's kind of an open-ended story, and it's left to a lot of self-interpretation where you can come to amends with the idea of it. Now, the idea of tohu and bohu are, if you look right here, are tehom in Hebrew, which is teamat, and tiawu wabohu that you look at here. This is supposed to be the primordial biblical Hebrew phrase found in Genesis creation narrative that describes the conditions of the earth are eretz, immediately before the creation, right? So it's formless and void, but then again, tohu and bohu are Tiamat and Bahamut, and the deep is personified as the goddess Tiamat, the enemy of Marduk. Here it is a formless body of primeval water surrounding the habitable world, to be released during the deluge, when all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth from waters beneath the earth and the windows of the sky. So again, in this model, they're holding back water, which everything is made of water, and we're floating in water. Okay, so this is how you get a lot of the ideas where we come from, fish and weird crap like that. We're floating in water, and then they separate a bubble around us, and we're living in this bubble, right? Imagine us floating on a speck of dirt that's suspended on top of water, floating in a spit bubble that surrounds the whole thing, right? There you go. Now, what they're giving the idea is that no, there's not air in the spit bubble in water, but it's water above too. And if they open up these windows, it's whenever it rains. And if somebody screws up or God gets mad and he opens everything all up one time, it'll ruin it all. Now, this is, of course, leading back to the Sumerian story, where whenever they got tired of everybody and they made too much noise, that the gods let loose the dams. That wasn't a rain from above and so on, but storms came with it. But whenever they did so, they let loose the dams, which instead of just giving a normal flood to the land, apparently flooded out the whole thing. Now, this is easily looked back now as being these people coming to amends with how could have they had such an incredible flood instead of a regular flood. Maybe they were all pissed off because we did just have the festival and everybody was, doing so and so, and maybe God couldn't sleep. The gods couldn't sleep. It angered them, and so they did this thing, which is odd because that was all a festival worshiping the concept of God. So they weren't doing it right. Something was wrong, and other people seeing this would go, aha, your God didn't like you. Everybody's real controlled by gods back then, and then other people would say everything was caused by it, and so you see a lot of finger pointing and things. And if you kill somebody's group or beat them, then they say, my God's stronger than your God. My dad can beat up your dad, right? Yeah. Okay, so anyhow, released during the deluge, all this water comes about. Now, the Ruach of God moves over the face of the deep before creation begins. Now, Ruach has the meanings of wind or spirit or breath, like the breath of life. And so the Elohim can mean great as well as God. And I tell you, that's not true. The Elohim is actually a plural council of gods, where God's name is El, like in the Bible with the angels, and everybody has an El name, like Ezekiel and Elijah and Israel and all those. It just goes on. I've got a list of them, a page and a half long. And then, of course, there's other ones that have Yah, which has to contend to the name Yahweh that they turn to. But that's a whole different thing. I'm not even going to go totally into that exact moment. I've done that in other videos. I've touched on pieces of this in other videos. I'm trying to put this together in a linear line, and then I'm going to have kind of a reveal more significant and deep than even this speaks of. Now, the store wind is God's breath. In Psalms 18:16 and elsewhere, the wind of God returns the flood story as means by which God can restore the earth, or God's spirit, a concept which is somewhat vague in the Hebrew Bible, or may simply signify a great storm wind. But I tell you, no, this is the same word that's used for them to supposedly part the Red Sea. Now, if you look into the ancient Hebrew, it never actually says the Red Sea. It says the Sea of Reeds. And the Sea of Reeds is off of Egypt there, where they had a giant reed forest that they would use to make all of this paper and so on with, right? And their giant reed huts that I've shown you, and the Sumerians did the same thing with their giant reed forest that they had growing out in their areas, right? And they made reed huts that, if you look back at 6000 BC, they had these incredible, looking almost resort looking cottages. I've got videos of that too. It says Abraham, land of Ur, Sumerian reed hut, and if you look at it, it's pretty interesting. But this breath of God, I'll show you something about this ruach that we're talking about here is neat, because ruach also has a root origin in Sumerian, and it is the air or wind, or when the storms come and bad winds and things like that is referred to by this. But ruach is got a symbology. Whenever they had, before the original even Phoenician style of writing, which blends into Hebrew, and reverse Phoenician is Greek. So this all comes together here on who got the language from where, when in the first place too. Well, these people come from Sumerian, Eden and Ur, over here in this other river valley, not in Egypt, but had migrated there after a great set of floods, bringing this story and blending it in. Now, and I'm showing you that through all of this, I want to show you what a ruach symbology looks like if you use the early ideograms that are there. And the same thing is found in Egyptian too, but it looks a little different, but I'll show this to you. So this is the symbology of Ru, and Ah, and K is actually an X with a circle around it. Now, K is actually giving symbology to a land. It denotes a place, like X marks the spot. And when they made the earliest maps, this is where it is. This is Ka, and this is X marks the spot. And what is that? Well, that's the cities, always, right? And so you see, even to this day, we'll put like a mark for cities and then a star for a capital, right? Okay. And so Ruach, oddly, for those people that look at this as being some type of UFO freakout thing, this is what Ruach would look like. And this would, and if you put the Ka under this, it would actually look kind of like the Earth sitting right below this with some wind above it, and then this spaceship looking thing, and then X marks the spot, almost from a distant land. And you can pull a lot of these ideas out of it. So a lot of people say that this is weird things. Now let me give you some symbology here off this. Now the idea is that this is like, when a bird takes up off the ground and it kicks up wind, but you can't see it, but you can see its effect on the ground, that God had done this. And you're like, oh, well, if God's going to come and blow the wind back like that, that could be like a spaceship type thing too. So you can keep equating it that way. And indeed, they have this idea that God helped to separate the waters. Well, it's never been the Red Sea. No one ever walked through that. To try to go down and across and up the Red Sea would require rappelling gear and everything. It's not something you could do. It's jagged all the way down to the bottom. 180 to 210, 220 foot goes all the way across. And that's right there at the place where they think that it is. And it's not even that close at other positions. So it never really happened in that situation. It says Sea of Reeds. It doesn't say Red Sea. But in the biblical idea, Abraham came across waters and then went to a different land, and 40 days journey, and for 40 years, and da-da-da. And you have the same thing where the Hebrews had to leave Egypt after 400 years and then spend 40 years in the desert, which is a generation. They had to go through a generation so they could go through this thing. And this is the idea that you can give somebody an idea and have a whole generation of people and their children have the idea, and then their children will pick up the new idea that you imply into a generation of people. And then, they got so destitute to where they were searching. I don't need to go there. This is what Ruach looks like. So now I'll go back and just go into this. I don't want to go so far out in left field. Already it takes me an hour to go through paragraphs here, people. But I just want to clarify what's being said and the way that it's being inferred. And then, of course, a lot of things are left out, just even in a common narrative that I can add constantly. So the Ruach of God moves over the face of the deep before creation begins. Now, Ruach has the meaning of wind and spirit, and Elohim is actually a plural and a council of gods. And as well as just being the name of God, supposedly, God is actually a council. It's plural. The Ruach Elohim may therefore be the wind and breath of God, the storm wind of God's breath in Psalms 18:16. Elsewhere in the wind of God returns in the flood story by means which God restores the earth, or God's Spirit, a concept which is somehow vaguely in Hebrew Bible, may simply signify a great storm wind. Now they have another word for glory, like God's glory in the Bible and things, but this also harkens to the idea of breathing life into a clay statue where they had breathed the breath of life into this. And this is a Sumerian tale where Enki had done these things. And it's echoed again in here, giving a different idea of it. But it's almost like, well, you've heard that they have that breath of life thing. Well, this is how that works. This is, you can see how this is really patternized off of the Sumerian tales. So if like you knew it real well, like say Abraham grew up in Ur and he knew all these tales real well, and then how someone could deviate that. And most of the Bible's only written after 500 BC in the first place. In fact, the language that we first find them writing with, the Hebrews didn't have a language to write down anything with for quite a long time after Exodus. If they were writing it down then, the only logical idea would be they wrote it down somehow in Egyptian, especially being trapped in Egypt and knowing from there. But that's a whole different aspect. I kind of go into that in my Exodus story. And I do one on Moses and the Exodus, and it's got it in there also. So I don't want to have to go there too deep now, but I just wanted to mention that fact. There are 6 days of creation, which ironically echoes the 6 days of Enki and the starting of the earth. And on the 7th day, he went ahead and had rest himself. Now, the first act was creation of undifferentiated light and dark, and then separated into night and day, their order, evening before morning, signifying that this was the liturgical day, and then the sun and moon and stars were created to mark the proper times for the festivals of the week and the year. The Hebrews did this thing where it was to an evening, if you know anything about their true original and origin beliefs. And also it didn't used to be on Sunday, it was on Saturday, which I'll go into in a minute. Only when this is done does God create man and woman and the means to sustain them, which plants and animals are there. At the end of the 6th day, when creation is complete, the world is a cosmic temple in which the role of humanity is the worship of God and to be gods over this earth in his stead. This parallels Mesopotamian myths of the Enuma Elish and also echoes chapter 38 of the book of Job, where God recalls how the stars and the sons of God sang when the cornerstone of creation was laid. And this shows you that also people were believed that whenever they died, they could become one of the millions of stars in the sky. If you were important enough, you became part of a constellation, and then the super gods were the ones that were moving around these wandering stars. Well, the wandering star is planet, that's what it means, and these planets were certain gods that were there. Now, Saturday, all the days of the week are named after different gods. Not this one, but different gods. And none of them are named after this one, supposedly, but they're named after all the other gods. And I've got one, the gods of the days of the week, can go in there, but Saturday was the worship of satyrs, It's Saturday, Satur, and that's Saturn, and Saturn, Kronos, El is his name in the Levant. In the Levant, they called him El. Greeks and Romans called him Saturn and Kronos. And that was the god name over the Levant and this whole area that's in question. And there's not some little island in the middle of it where they have a god where they say El this, Elohim, El that, Temp El, Angel, Mike El, Ariel, Gabriel, and El doesn't mean the name of God. It does in the Bible. They say, well, it means God. You know, Bethel is the house of God, and Beth is house, and El is the name of God. You wouldn't have in the middle of that little island just a people that would have a word that just meant God, and it would be El also, but it meant a different one. You see what I'm saying? It would be very ironic to look back and know this knowledge, and then all of a sudden that just doesn't compute. Let's continue. So this is echoed in there, and the sons of God, and they're going to become stars. Now we're called the sons of God sang when the cornerstone of creation came down, and then that's the idea also of the angels that fell from heaven. 1/3 of the angels fell from heaven and caused all this problem. This is when a giant meteor storm hit the planet. And if you've looked at my Halloween one that I have, it talks about how that time every year there's this meteor shower that happens that we quite often get pelted with one from. There's one also in the spring. We run through this cometary trail that's ironically named Comet Inky, and it's disintegrated itself going around the sun, leaving this trail that we keep running back through. And when we run through bigger spots, we run through problems. And indeed, there's quite a bit of chunk material that we run through. And you can tell we've been doing it for a long time because the moon is pelted with it. It's one of the reasons that there are very few strikes on the moon that are at any angle whatsoever, is because we're just running right through this stuff. Like bugs on your windshield. Right? I go into a deal about craters and things too. There's very few craters you can find anywhere that aren't direct hits like that. And there's a few reasons for that. We're not going to go there now. So, on that first day, let's look at that whenever we're talking about it. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, and then it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning in one day. Now this leads you to believe that now we've created the sun and the world's spinning around. And of course now we see an evening and an evening, and the sun goes down, and da-da-da. And of course, and it says the evening. So you get this idea of what Eve is when we talk about it later. But dawn and evening, right? Or the eve is before, right? Like All Hallows Eve, right? And where this concept comes from, that's put in as a name really of somebody named Hua, which is a Sumerian name in your Bible again, along with other Greek names that are in there. Anyhow, ironically here we've created light, but I think it's on the fourth day coming up where we actually will create the sun and the moon. And so, how is this and the plants happen? Let's move on. Day one begins with the creation of light, and by implication, time starts then. God creates by spoken command and names the elements of the world as he creates them. In the ancient Near East, the act of naming was bound up with the act of creating. Thus, in Egyptian literature, the Creator God pronounced the names of everything, and that brought it into being. And so, you can find in Egyptian where they talk about that there was the word, right? And a concept like that. It's there. And of course, a scholar at the time that was alive at the time of Jesus had this same concept that was out in the Greeks, which I tell you are connected into the creation of this Bible. And they had said that they had the Logos. And if you look in the Bible, that's the word that's used. And it means the Word. And how God spoke things into being with this concept that's here. Right? God's creation by speech also just suggests that he is being compared to a king who is merely has to speak for things to happen. So it already shows you that we're at that level, and that, like whenever they tell you, so let it be written, so let it be done. When Ramsey says something and he da-da-da, just like in the movie, so let it be written, so let it be done. And it gets done. In fact, if it doesn't get done, we figure out a way to get it eventually done, and then we write down that that's the way we wanted it done in the first place. There's no mistakes. Quite often in a lot of the old literature, there's no defeats that Egypt runs into, although when we look at all of it, there's a few times where they really get repelled and defeated a little bit, but it's never looked at as defeat. It's looked at as being a victory in some sense of the word. And indeed, they didn't get overrun before then, so it was a victory in a lot of ways, but they would push out and get defeated back and then say that, yeah, we pushed out till there, it was a great victory. Well, you were trying to push to farther. But anyhow, so the second day, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now this is where this shell comes up, this raka comes up, and now we're trapped inside of a bubble, and this bubble is either made out of tin or made out of glass. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And so now in this bubble we're in, there's water below and water above. There's water above us on the planet. We're in a bubble, trapped on a floating water that's inside that bubble, on a floating cork of land that's fixing to show up, right? Okay? And God called the firmament heaven, and there was the evening and there was the morning, and a second day, right? Now, did he say it was good there? It's funny, he says it's good on every single one, but I believe we just read that through, and even though he says it's good, he doesn't actually say it right there, does he? Anyhow, so he calls this firmament heaven. Well, he talk about this firmament being this thin thing that's pushed up. So now the belief is there isn't space. It doesn't go on for a long ways at all. All this is just bubbles and glitter in the sky that's right there past the clouds. You see? Now, rakia is the word translated as firmament, and it's from raka, the verb used to act of beating metal into thin plates. I like the Bara people in creation, where they're creating metal, creating thin plates. Created on the second day of creation and populated by luminaries on the fourth, right? So that's whenever they finally get the things going on. But yet, how are we having days? Well, God is the light, because Jesus is the sun. Well, Jesus is the sun God, so I guess so. But then what's this that creates the other? No, hold on. It's a solid dome which separates the earth from below the heavens and their waters above, as an Egyptian and Mesopotamian belief at the same time. They had this concept, right? And I'm telling you, the Greeks had this same idea too. But they knew the world was round, and the Sumerians knew the world was round. They talked about it in the eclipse and how it makes a shadow. I've gone into that in videos. Won't go through it here. It takes 5 minutes. In Genesis 1:17, the stars are set in the rakia. So that's bubbles in the firmament. In Babylonian myth, the heavens were made of various precious stones, compared to Exodus 24:10, where the elders of Israel see God on the sapphire floor of heaven with the stars engraved on their surface. Now in the Sumerian tale, they tell you about it's all made of silver and lapis lazuli and gold, and that the floor is finely polished. So it shows you they do have that fine polish concept already going on, although a lot of what we looked at is slightly sandblasted over time. And indeed, a lot of the effigies you see around there were painted. We see now little flicks of paint everywhere onto them, and know that they were basically painted. So they weren't just left graphed like they were, but they weren't to a fine polish. Certain things were, and they knew how to do so before the concept had come out where they talk about it, and how the fine polished floor looks like space when you walk on it. I had a dream about this when I was a kid after hearing this stuff and kept reading about it. And it, in basically what I thought, it was like the floor is so polished that whenever you walk on it, you can see the reflection of the sky in it. Like it's a black marble granite. And because of that, and at nighttime, you can see the reflection into it of the sky. Or the marble swirl makes you think of that with the speckles that are in it and the different and how different it looks whenever you fine polish it. But I opted for the idea of a fine reflection off of the sky. And so at this point, they don't have a roofing over the place that's finely polished. Could be one reason why it's not finely polished anymore. Anyhow, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. So in other words, they pulled the water together under. So waters went down and together. Everything was flooded, and then the waters gathered down into the ocean. Now this echoes that same concept of the 11,000 BC meteor strike that caused a great flood and water exploding up and then causing rain to come down, probably 40 days worth, huh? Anyhow, and then a mist and problems and things that arise out of it. And God said, let the dry earth and the gathering together of the waters, he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth put forth grass, herb-yielding seed, and fruit-bearing trees of its kind, whereas the seed upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb-yielding seed after its kind, and the tree-yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind. And God saw that it was good. So there's a good there. And there was the evening and the morning and a third day. Now, this is looked at as more of a Johnny Appleseed concept, where God didn't. There's two ways of looking at it. One, he willed things to just grow up out of the ground and there was no seed. But no, this is more of a Johnny Appleseed concept, where he had gone and planted forth the earth everywhere where it was, like you would in a video game trying to populate someplace. But he could do this all in one day, boom, like Santa Claus in one day. Now on the third day, the waters withdrew, creating a ring of ocean surrounding the single circular continent, which is the original Babylonian picture, where there's grounds, but in every direction you went, although they didn't go totally north because that turned into ice, which they called firmament. And if you went down too far south, there was ice, and up on top of mountains, so they knew that it was warmer on the earth and colder up in space, and ice and these things. Anyhow, by the end of the third day, God has created a foundation environment of light, heaven, seas, and earth. The three levels of the cosmos are next populated in the next order which way they are created. Now the heavens, sea, and the earth, which doesn't make any sense when we've been having days and night and light and darkness already. But God does not create or make trees and plants, but instead commands the earth to produce them. The underlying theological meaning seems to be that God has been given the previously barren earth the ability to produce vegetation. Or perhaps in our concept, everything got pretty much screwed, but then what allowed you to come back were areas of vegetation which had naturally formed long ago, like jungles and so on, and things that got choked out after the flood, mud, and all these things miraculously sprung up out of this mud. According to one's kind, appears to look forward to the laws found later in the Pentateuch, which lay great stress on holiness through separation, and also everything having to be with one's kind, and no bestiality and all that weird stuff, and the laws that are in there too, and that God had already kind of set things like this. Now we're supposed to all be in harmony with creatures too. I mean, you walk right up and pet a lion. Anyhow, fourth day, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night. So this may be like stars. And then let them be for signs and for seasons and for the days and years. And this is the zodiac and how we call them. And it shows you the importance of the zodiac at that time already, and that they knew that it was for the seasons, signs, days, and years. Now signs could be bad, and it's omens and all those things that we, of course, know zodiacal crap. I mean, Sun come up, moon go down, world spin round and round. Time for another lesson, grasshopper. Right? He goes, let them be lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. So now what this is the idea they're saying that the sun is on fire and the moon is glowing too, so there's got to be some light. And they didn't understand the idea that this was really just a reflection. And the Sumerians know this. The Sumerians showed how you could put a fruit near a fire, and the fire is the sun, and how it looks, and then the idea of going into night and everything. You know, if you extrapolate what they say, you get the idea that that's what they had an idea going on. They also, conspicuously in one tablet, it says that the stars that you see in the sky are merely but like our sun, but as a torch in the distance, far, far away. And that's actually reality. And for people who have had that idea way before Copernicus and all these concepts that we come up with later is quite amazing when you look into it. But nobody knows about this. It's all looked over. No, that's all pagan BS. Well, I'm telling you, this is where all this comes from. This is its origin, and it wasn't really pagan. And at one time, people knew a lot more. These people got destroyed and then were coming through a fog later in a different concept of humanity and looking back at it and can't quite fathom. And we have this some type of, where we've lost our minds and we're having amnesia toward the concept of where we come from, and there was no recording to leave it to giving you a correct truth to it. This tries to reconcile that, and it does not do a fantastic job in our modern day if you give yourself the time to look into it, but you can find its truths if you do. Now, in the fourth, the language of ruling is introduced, and the heavens and bodies will govern day and night by marked seasons of years, and a day of a matter of crucial importance to the priestly authors, as religious festivals were organized around the cycles of the sun and the moon, and certain times of the year are marked on zodiacal lines. So here we get the idea of having those circular stones and the setup and the lines and the lineation, and whenever it starts to come into here, trying to keep up with years. Later, man will be created to rule over the whole of creation as God's regent, but God puts light in the firmament to rule over the day and night. Specifically, God creates the greater light and lesser light and the stars. According to Victor Hamilton, most scholars agree that the choice of greater light and lesser light rather than the more explicit sun and moon is an anti-mythological rhetoric intending to contradict widespread contemporary beliefs that the sun and moon were deities themselves written at that time. They're just saying, oh, it's a greater light and a lesser light they created because at this time everybody had sun worshippers. The Sumerians had worshipped the sun god Shamash. These aspects of humanity were all worshipped as gods in one way or another. Before that, it becomes a nature worship. There's snake worship and things because they can look like they're getting old and just shed their skin and they're brand new again. Look like they can live forever. They can eat, and you can trap them inside a jar and let them be in there for a couple of months and then pull them out knowing that they're dead now, and they're not, but they shed it and they look brand new. What the hell's going on here? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it has the same concept where he stole the food of life. It's supposed to make you young again, and the snake goes off and sheds, which I believe I talked about in the earlier one here. Anyhow, it's that kind of idea where they're taking it away. Now, on the fifth day, strangely though, by the way, the sun and the moon are inside of this rakia. They're inside the globe. They're the same size. The moon barely passing in front of the sun, right? And they had this idea that the sun cooking the moon had ruined it and just kind of made it old. And that's why it looked like the dead man in the moon. The Sumerians had a story where it was Kingu's head had gone pale, forever facing Ki, which Ki had been almost destroyed by this event with Tiamat and everything. And in the idea, it created the Van Allen asteroid belt and the sea of stars that you see out there, and that its leftover moon was his bodyguard's head, who had got cut off in the encounter of something that may have actually went down in a certain way back when, but his head constantly facing her, always in reverence, gone pale, is the man in the moon himself. And his name was Kingu, and that's in reverence to him having given himself up to make everything happen on earth. It's the idea of where we get king from. And Nanar Sin was a moon god king. He was a priest king, but he was taken from divinity, and mankind was given this ruling area. Now on the fourth day, language of ruling is introduced, in the heavens of bodies will govern day and night, mark seasons of years, as a matter of crucial importance to those priestly authors. Like I said, you can see it definitely there. On the fifth, though, God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the fowl fly above the earth in an open firmament of heaven. And God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that creepeth wherewith the waters swarmed, and of its kind, and winged fowl after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the waters and seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And there was this evening, and there was a morning, and a fifth day. Now, strangely, we're not supposed to believe that a coelacanth was around way before now, and then everything else that we know of kind of as our concept before, just dinosaurs, nothing. It doesn't exist. We know that that's kind of taken strange. Now, in the Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythologies, the creator god has to do battle with the sea monsters, and indeed so does the Canaanite god El, who fights Yam, the sea god, before he can make heaven and earth. In Genesis 1:21, the word Tannin, sometimes translated as sea monsters or great creatures, parallels the named chaos monsters of Rahab and Leviathan in Psalms 74:13 and Isaiah 27:1 and Isaiah 51:9. But there's no hint in Genesis of combat, and the Tannin are simply creatures created by God, but also they tell you that God kills Leviathan and he gives it to the people of the wilderness, and they supposedly only gave him a portion of it. Jewish lore is that they've saved the rest of it for everyone to eat at the second coming. It's supposed to be the feast of the second coming, that you get the other half of the world. Do you see what that leads people to think? Now, Tannin is a Carthaginian and Canaanite goddess, but also is said to be a sea god or sea goddess, and then she had been killed back in the day, right at the edge of recorded time. And is this the concept we're talking about in Yam? And the idea of conquering the sea, wasn't this from Neptune himself and the people of Poseidon and the people that lived in Sidon just above Jerusalem, and these Phoenicians, and how they had controlled and conquered the sea, and they told you there was dragons out here and don't go in your boats, but yet they sure did, didn't they? And brought language to everybody. Let's continue here. On the sixth day, God said, let the earth bring, so back a day, by the way, how did he put all the stuff on the land and the plants, but then he didn't even create a light source to have even made it happen. And you know as well as I do, if you take a bean plant, that thing don't grow unless it has the sun. And God made the beasts of the earth after every kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the ground in its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle,